I mean, Republicans are saying it's just money.
Listen, Galen, the facts don't care about your feelings.
The American dream is not built on cheap goods, Mary.
It's all just ones and zeros. Don't worry about it.
I'm gonna pay $500 for my next pair of Nikes.
Let's do it. I can already tell this is going to be a good podcast. Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk, and I'm not an economic expert, but it seems like there's some crazy going on in the markets. In the 2 days following President Trump's Liberation Day tariff announcement, the markets posted a 10% loss, the biggest two-day drop since the COVID crash, and amongst the biggest in history overall. We are recording this podcast before markets have closed on Monday, and things have been all over the place so far today. But the S&P 500, at least at one point, dipped into bear market territory and then has rebounded since. But that bear market territory means that it dropped 20% off of its recent high. So what's going on here? Take a step back. I had just started my freshman year of college when the 2008 financial crisis hit. And for at least the next 4 years, the whole time I was in college, there were plenty of courses on offer trying to explain what exactly happened, how to resolve it, and how to prevent it in the future. As much as credit default swaps and subprime mortgages might sound, at the very least, familiar today, it was not immediately apparent what was going on back then. This time, it seems pretty clear to everyone what's going on. Trump presented a plan to erect massive tariffs not seen since the first part of the 20th century. He claimed that they were reciprocal, but in fact appear to have no relation to the tariffs that other countries put on our goods. And the market is now reacting to the possibility of slower growth and even a recession, coupled with higher prices on goods. So today, we're going to talk about some of the math behind what Trump says he's doing, how the public is reacting, and here with me to do it all are two friends and former colleagues, Mary Radcliffe and Elliott Morris. Mary, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Galen, thanks for having me.
It's so great to have you, and also here with us, Elliott Morris. You are the author of the Substack Strength in Numbers. Congratulations. I guess the Substack isn't new, but congratulations on a reinvigorated Substack presence. Everyone, please go check it out and subscribe, but welcome to the podcast, Elliott.
Thanks, Galen. Dude, we're getting the game back together. This is great. Let's go. I mean, the economy sucks, but that's all right.
You know, whatever it takes to get the gang back together. I should say, though, I have actually already recorded a podcast with Mary that has yet to air. It is the sort of farewell podcast that never happened from the night of the fake State of the Union when we didn't really say goodbye, but we knew it was our final podcast. That is going to come out at some point, I promise. It's just been that there's way too much news to actually publish it. And so I was thinking of publishing it today, and then on Friday I was like, I think we're going to have to talk about the economy.
Yeah, I think you were right there.
Unfortunately.
Elliott, you're a data scientist. Mary, you have a PhD in math. Please explain to me and anyone else who is curious Trump's Liberation Day tariff scheme from a math perspective.
So the Trump administration, in setting their tariff rates, wanted to try to build a tariff that would promote trade balance between different countries. So what that means is when they calculated the tariff rate for each country, they took into account the trade imbalance between those countries and set a higher tariff rate if there was a higher trade imbalance, meaning that we import more from that country than we export to it, and a lower rate if there's a lower trade imbalance, or perhaps the imbalance is in our favor. Even in those cases, we still have a baseline 10% tariff rate. Now, the mechanism that they use to set those rates seems to have been perhaps miscalculated or misapplied. There's reporting that they incorrectly set some of those variables, which may have resulted in significantly higher tariff rates than they intended. Whether that was intentional or that was oversight, I don't know that we know at this time. But that seems to be the approach here, is a real focus on balancing out trade between nations.
So the tariff rates for, say, China are set by taking the trade imbalance, as Mary's calling it, which is the goods that we export to China minus the value of the goods that we import from China, which is in this case like a couple $100 billion, I believe, divided by the total amount of trade between our two countries. It's the administration's attempt to figure out of all the goods that we are exchanging, how much are benefiting America, sold by America, versus those that are benefiting China in their narrative. And then all of that is divided by some estimate of the amount of money that is then passed on to the consumer in form of tax, which I think this is what Mary alludes to, is where they've made a pretty egregious academic mistake in assuming that only 25% of the tariff rate is passed on to consumers instead of 95%. It's their attempt to be as punishing as possible without hurting us.
Yeah, exactly. That 25 versus 95. I mean, 95 is practically 100%. So you could basically view it as essentially all of the tariffs are 4 times higher than they would have been if they had used the correct value for that variable.
And even if they, maybe to jump ahead, even if they'd said it correctly, this is like a totally asinine policy goal. What they're trying to do is, allegedly, the idea is that if you set these rates to be the equilibrium between imports and exports for any given country, then you can have a total trade balance between any other country, which sounds good if you brand it as fairness between the countries, but it's not fair for consumers because we don't need to have a total trade balance with Madagascar. They're not buying from us, and we're going to be buying. I mean, I don't know what Madagascar gives us, but it's just
Probably.
yeah. Or to take the coffee example, we get a ton of coffee from Colombia. There's a lot more American consumers buying coffee from the grocery store that comes from Colombia than there are Colombians buying stuff from America, and it's not entirely clear why you would want that to be equal if it means that prices for coffee in America are going to go up 4x.
Yeah, I mean, there's also just basic population issues in terms of equal trade, right? Madagascar has 30 million people and America has 300 million people. So if Madagascar is making a product we really want, we're going to buy a lot of it, but they don't have as many consumers for American goods.
Well, I think there's also a piece here, which is that when people heard reciprocal, they thought okay, if the EU places, and I'm just making up a number here, 15% tariff on all American agricultural goods, then we're going to levy a 15% tariff on all European agricultural goods. But that is very distinctly not what happened here, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And one of the arguments that the Trump administration is making and other folks who are on the airwaves defending the Trump administration is okay, trade barriers are made up of a lot more than tariffs. There's also and this is true, there's also domestic policy that will encourage sort of more production of domestic goods that ultimately ends up meaning that their consumers buy more of European goods than American goods or what have you. And so just levying a reciprocal tariff wouldn't actually do the intended job. First off, is this a legitimate goal to try to diminish the trade imbalance, to try to reshore manufacturing by levying some kind of penalty on goods that come from abroad?
Well, it's really 2 questions that you're asking there, Caitlin. There's the question about trade imbalance, and there's the question about reshoring manufacturing. And I think you probably need to take those 2 points separately because they're really different. With respect to trade imbalance, so it's not entirely clear to me why we should think that we should have balanced trade. Significant portion of the U.S. economy is a service economy, right? We're not making stuff. We do email jobs and things like that, right?
We do things like this. We podcast.
Exactly.
We are making value for GDP right now.
Exactly.
We have 5% of our audience is Canadian. And they will pay no tariff when they go to download this podcast. And still, we Americans are creating value and even taking their money.
The example I like to give is that I have a pretty significant trade imbalance with my local Giant Eagle supermarket. Right? They have...
Mary, they don't buy anything from you?
Yeah. They have a significant number of goods available for sale at my local Giant Eagle supermarket that I either cannot or do not desire to produce myself. And this is why commerce exists, so that I can exchange money for those goods and services that I do not have the ability or inclination to produce myself. This is normal. We should not expect every single country to be producing exactly the same amount of goods. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So with respect to trade imbalance, I don't really understand why it would be of vital national interest to balance trade with every other country in the world when we're producing, where this doesn't even take into account services, it doesn't take into account technology companies, software companies, all of that is produced in America, no tariffs on any of those kinds of things. So like, are we even really suffering a trade imbalance from that perspective? I'm not sure. Now, with respect to reshoring production, I think there's a more defensible argument for certain kinds of production in the United States, not all, but I think it is maybe in our national interests to have some of our technology production reshored. Joe Biden did this too with the Chips and Science Act, right? We want to bring some of that tech production back into America, because if we have only essentially like Taiwan for chips, for example, then geopolitics can get in the way of us being able to access computer chips, and that's a big problem. So I think there is some defensible argument for bringing certain kinds of highly technical manufacturing back to the United States in the event that geopolitics prevents us from importing them from elsewhere. I don't know that that argument makes as much sense when you're looking at lower cost goods like apparel, things like that. There's no reason I can think of why it would be vital national interest to reshore that production.
Well, in case any of our listeners have not been spending copious amounts of time on social media over the past 3 days, the memes have gotten really good. And so, like, for example, one is like an AI generated image of Bill Ackman, sewing a pair of Nike shoes in a sweatshop. And this is in response to the idea that we need to bring manufacturing back to the United States, including, I don't know if sewing counts as low skill or high skill manufacturing. Sewing a pair of sneakers seems pretty hard to me, but it's also not all that desirable of a career, I think, for a lot of people in the United States. But folks will make the argument that, look, ever since free trade has proliferated, our manufacturing base has hollowed out. There are far fewer good jobs for non-college educated Americans. And as a result, there's also a whole host of social ills that come with that. It means that, people don't have the jobs required to fund a mortgage and get married and have kids and all this kind of stuff. And so on the one hand, you look and they say, well, this policy, we're trying to fix that problem with this policy. You bring back the manufacturing. Now you have the Midwest flourishes again, the downtown that's been boarded up, whatever. And that's not just the Midwest. I grew up in upstate New York where you see that kind of too.
Okay. Like Youngstown, the decline in Youngstown, Ohio is like terrible for the people who live in Youngstown, Ohio, because the factories left. Like, same thing about Gary, Indiana. Like, decline of manufacturing there, terrible for the people who live there. What about everybody else? Why did those places close when you offshored manufacturing jobs? And what about the economy has changed as a result of the money that would have been spent on those manufacturing jobs locally being spent on other things? What if we had an automotive centered economy through 2015 and like did not invest so much money in technology? How would the world be different? What would the economy here be different? I mean, or like, take the extreme example. Would you crash the global economy to bring back manufacturing jobs in one area, or to affect 1% of the population at most? Probably not.
So you're saying it's a trade-off, and in this trade-off, parts of America have lost, but the whole of America has gained, is what you're saying.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And I actually think that what people are lamenting when they are lamenting the loss of the good-paying American manufacturing job, what they are actually lamenting is the loss of robust union protections for low-skilled work, right? We have replaced, I think, probably most, if not all, maybe more than all, of our manufacturing labor force with Amazon warehouse workers. But you know what they don't have? A union. So if this kind of job still exists, right? It looks like a different shape, maybe, but it doesn't have the robust union protections, which led to the high wages, which is what people are really looking back fondly upon in this sort of manufacturing heyday.
I'm just imagining the Soviet Union anthem playing in the background right now.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Like, Is anyone on the left happy with these tariffs? Because for most of my lifetime, the argument in favor of what Trump is doing is an argument you would have heard from Bernie Sanders types, not like people who are going on CNBC arguing in favor of a Republican White House's trade policy.
Other than Jared Golden, I don't know that if I've seen any Democrats defending this specific approach. I mean, look, I think you're right that you have seen progressive figures be more interested in protectionist trade policy, the sort of more populist bent of the Democratic Party. However, I suspect that the sort of making math mistakes ham-handed, insane way that the Trump administration is approaching this is probably not going to be well defended by those sorts of folks.
Yeah, there's a lot of DSA speakers in $2,000 loafers, expensive suits, saying that they're going to offshore all your jobs, all of your manufacturing, and take the profits for themselves. I just think that this is very, very reductive. They'd say, oh, tariffs are progressive taxation because you're only taxed if you consume. But you know who has to consume goods and is benefits when they're cheaper is people with less money than the people making this argument. For a long time, we thought this was a really disingenuous argument from the left, and now we're taking it as a much more serious economic argument because the president is making it. But the way that he's implementing this is not any less serious than the previous criticism, in my humble opinion.
Okay, well, speaking of the way he's implementing it, it seems so far like Trump can do this fully unilaterally. Is there a role for Congress here? And if there is, what could they do? How could folks rein Trump in if they wanted to?
It's an Article 1 power to regulate foreign commerce and interstate commerce. They have given that power, Congress has given that power via act of Congress to the president in times of economic emergencies to levy tariffs. They did this because historically Congress was a lot more protectionist than the president. The idea would be that the president could use his authority to broker deals or further foreign policy goals or what have you. This is another example where Trump just blows up the historical preconceptions about legislation, about the relationship between Congress and the president, and goes, balls to the wall, let's say, with his own policy. So yeah, they can take that power back tomorrow. They can pass a law to take the power back tomorrow if they wanted to.
Yeah, there is a bill that's been introduced in the Senate, at least, that would require Congress to approve tariffs levied by the president. And it actually looks like it has pretty significant support. The last whip count I saw had, I think, 6 or 7 Republican senators on board with passing this. I suspect it's going nowhere in the House and would be vetoed by the president. He's already made statements to that effect. So, yes, they can take the power back by passing a new law, but the barriers to that are pretty significant.
And I mean, there's a real pro-business argument here in favor of tariffs like these needing to pass the House and Senate, because even if this is a really good industrial policy or trade policy, even if it would accomplish absolutely everything that Trump wants it to in terms of reshoring manufacturing and creating good jobs that don't require a college degree, it may take 3 to 4 years to build a manufacturing plant in Texas or Gary or Youngstown, at which point we may be electing a new president who decides that they don't want to implement any of these tariffs. In fact, we've already heard from business leaders that, okay, well, the last time you implemented tariffs on China, we moved our production to Vietnam, but now you have a more than 40% tariff on goods from Vietnam. So we kind of don't know what to do here. And if we make big moves in one direction or another, who's to say they won't just be undone by the next president? So we hear it time and time again from business leaders, sort of stability and predictability are 2 important factors in economic growth. And so even if you love this policy, having it be fully in the hands of the executive is going to make it pretty ineffective long-term anyway.
Cosign.
Yeah, I mean, it's persuasive to me. And not to be, I don't know, I don't want to be too unfair to the tariff regime, I guess, for some reason. But, who's going to work in these factories, Galen? So, in part of the decline of manufacturing over the last 30 years is a decline in the workforce that does manufacturing. A lot of the people you might expect to do manufacturing are also being deported. So, like, who's going to do it? Are the fired federal workers going to make toasters? Who's going to work the manufacturing jobs?
Yeah, what's the unemployment rate? Like 4%?
Well, isn't the argument always if you pay folks enough, then they'll do the job, right? Like, who wants to be a garbage man? But
All right, enjoy your $5,000
$5,000
iPhone. It takes 2 seconds to think through how this could be bad policy for the US, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that this is functionally the same sort of workforce that the analogy I made earlier, that this is the same sort of workforce as the Amazon warehouse workforce, like the same collection of human people would do both of those kinds of jobs. And so I guess you would have to be paying at a rate that's comparable to the Amazon warehouse, which starts at $15 an hour, right?
Today's podcast is not brought to you by a direct-to-consumer mattress company. It's not brought to you by a hair loss or erectile dysfunction medication provider. And it's also not brought to you by a business-to-business e-commerce platform. Today's podcast is brought to you by you, the listener. I'm in the early stages of getting this podcast off the ground, and it will only succeed with your support. I want to bring you coverage that embraces curiosity, rigor, and a sense of humor. And I want to bring it to you on a regular basis with more episodes, more insight, and more laughs. I can only do that if you subscribe to and support this podcast. Go to gdpolitics.com and become a paid subscriber today. Even better, do it right now. gdpolitics.com, that's G as in gosh, D as in darn, and politics as in that hot mess. Head to gdpolitics.com to subscribe, and thank you. Okay, so we've talked through some of the mainly demerits and some of the merits of such trade policy. Let's talk about how Americans are reacting. The most visible manifestation right now of what's going on is the stock market, because many of these tariffs have not actually gone into effect yet, so people aren't necessarily seeing it in the stores. How much does the stock market affect public opinion, sort of the economy, of the current administration, in terms of like right track, wrong track type stuff? Elliott, I know you've looked a little bit at some of this.
Yeah, I don't know. One way to think about it is like 50% of Americans have exposure to the stock market. They have stocks or they have pensions or something that's invested in the stock market. And even more, and the percentage that either have stocks or watch the news and see the Dow Jones chart going like this, inverse elbow, is probably even larger. And at this point, probably approaching 100%, right? Given the news of the last, or 90%, given the news of the last couple of days. So this is, it's not the case that like this is happening in a vacuum and people don't care about it or won't see it. As for the I think one number that comes to mind is, in our forecast of presidential elections, the decrease or increase in the stock market over the last year before a presidential election correlates with change in the vote share for the incumbent party at about 0.6. So you can very well explain the incumbent party's fortunes by the way the stock market is going. So I mean, this is going to be bad for Republicans. I think we can pretty empirically say if it continues.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask folks directly, so YouGov asked this question in early March this year, so well before any of this tariff stuff was going down. They asked respondents, to what extent, if at all, does it matter to you what happens in the stock market? And you had 26% say a great deal and 33% say somewhat. So that's 59% overall of Americans saying at least care a little bit about this. You have another 34% saying doesn't matter much or not at all. So people are paying attention to it. Now, it's probably not the most important factor when people are thinking about the economy. I don't think the stock market is the most important factor, but I do think it's an important data point to put in the context of everything Americans are consuming about the state of the economy right now. Americans are still extremely concerned about inflation. They do believe that tariffs are going to significantly increase inflation in huge numbers. And on top of that, you're going to throw in all the stock market collapsing sort of news, like world markets crashing. I think that altogether is going to have a pretty we're down to a pretty negative effect.
I'll just give one more number here, which is I took all of the issue approval polls for Trump conducted in February and March. So that's questions like, do you approve of the job the president is doing on X, where X is like Social Security, Israel, Palestine, or trade and tariffs. And in March, before all of this went down, only 39% of people said they approved of Trump's job on tariffs, and already 60% disapproved, 57% disapproved. So he's already 20 points underwater on tariffs before he crashes the global stock market and claims credit for it on True Social. So like, what's the policy strategy here? One might ask the White House.
Yeah, yeah. Our friend and former pollster Adam Carlson has a rolling polling average on a bunch of those issue approvals, and on 3 different categories: the economy, inflation, and tariffs. Trump is underwater by double digits for inflation and tariffs, and by about 8 points on the economy. So not looking good.
And this is, I just want to take a minute here because we have been talking about, well, not on this podcast, but in the podcast that came before this podcast, talking for like almost a decade about what the public thinks about Trump. And for the vast majority of that time, even when Trump was well underwater on overall approval, Americans thought better of his performance on the economy and some other things too, like crime and national security, and then at a certain point immigration as well, than they thought of him. So people would be like, I don't really like Trump, but I do actually think he's a good steward of the economy. That has turned on its head. At this very moment, his overall approval rating is net -3. I think that's probably outdated at this very moment. Like, we don't have a lot of new approval data since the stock market events of Thursday and Friday of last week.
Yeah, I haven't seen any.
I'll withhold my judgment. Who knows? But
maybe all the pollsters ran out of money.
I have a feeling that could go down. But today, Americans, there are more Americans out there who are like, I don't know, Trump is fine, but I really don't like what he's doing with the economy. That has not been the case before. That is new to this very moment in this administration.
Yep. Well, because he's doing some pretty extreme stuff that we have not seen before. We have been talking in various venues for years about how people are really upset about inflation and high prices, and people are looking at these tariff moves and they believe that they will cause inflation and higher prices. There's a Wall Street Journal poll that was conducted last week, before all the tariff stuff, that asked if people thought tariffs on goods from other countries would make things more expensive or less expensive. 75% said more expensive. People are expecting more inflation, and they really, really hate inflation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also to your point, we've been talking for a while about how on tariffs, if you ask Americans, do you want to levy tariffs? YouGov has been tracking this for a while. They would say yes. Not a huge majority, but a slim majority of Americans would say, yes, we want to levy tariffs. And then when you say, okay, but what if it makes your blue jeans $20 more expensive or $50 more expensive? And as soon as that is taken into account, support for tariffs falls precipitously. Things have changed now where even if you don't talk about rising prices, they just say, do you want to levy tariffs on foreign countries? The majority of Americans say, no, we don't.
Yeah, I've been seeing that too.
Okay, so how does this play out in terms of different parts of the electorate is my next question. I think we've seen some of the tech/media bros maybe not turning on Trump fully. Actually, no, I'll say this. Embodying the type of voter that we see in the polls who's like, oh, I don't know, I still kind of like Trump, but I really don't like what he's doing on the economy. So folks like Bill Ackman, folks like Dave Portnoy, who have been using their platforms to kind of plead with the president to stop doing what he's doing.
Even Elon Musk.
I didn't see that.
Who is what did Elon Musk say?
Elon Musk was doing like a series of tweets about how zero tariffs and totally free trade is like the way to be.
Comrade Elon Musk. Welcome to the resistance, Elon Musk.
So who are the likeliest people to turn on Trump as a result of all of this when we're looking at the electorate, not just naming sort of tech and media bros?
So I don't know. One way I'm thinking about it is like, Now, we're used to thinking about people as occupying some point in like left liberal economic and left liberal social space, where like if you're a social liberal, you might be like down here on the graph and what have you. But I think probably the better way to think about people in America now is occupying like a left liberal, liberal conservative economic space, and also engaged and disengaged. And what we saw, in my opinion, in 2024 is a lot of the disengaged voters who otherwise would have had like center, maybe center right or center left economic preferences, realigning toward Trump on their engagement axis because they were really reactive to higher prices or Joe Biden's age or the political climate in 2024, whatever. And I would expect that those people who are relatively disengaged, and I think we can do some storytelling, who like bought Trump's argument that his economic record in 2017 through 2019 was better than the high inflation regime of Joe Biden. Like that was a reason to vote for him, and they're not super into politics, and they bought on that argument pretty quick. I think those people who like normally aren't paying attention are really motivated by economics, which I think is a lot of people. I mean, I would
Right,
say
not
like maybe
ideological, but sort of in some
they're
ways
just
performance
people.
based.
Yeah, I mean,
you fuck
honestly,
up the
these could
economy,
be
I'll vote against you.
these could be like this like the like coalition of reason in American politics, you might even say. They usually are normies. These are the people you find at the bar and talk to about the economics, and they're like, oh, my like 401k sucks. I worked 40 years for it.
Yeah.
Those people I expect to be moved by this.
Yeah, I think you can apply a last in, first out kind of rule here, right? Like folks that are softest in their support are going to be people who have not voted for Trump in the past and did vote for him in 2024, which we know there are a lot of because it's the first time he's won the popular vote. But we're talking about folks that changed their mind, decided to vote for Trump because of the particular factors of the 2024 election, which, as Elliott rightly points out, is mostly inflation. That's going to be a lot of younger voters, and the sort of non-traditional constituencies that we saw moving towards Republicans. I don't expect you're going to get all of those people to move, but I think that generally, like, the softer support is going to be recent converts.
We saw protests over the weekend. We've seen Republicans put up bad numbers in special elections. At this point, how strong of a backlash is there to Trump, maybe compared with 8 years ago?
So relevant benchmark for people, 11%. That is or 11 percentage points. That's the increase in Democratic vote margin in districts that have had special elections from 2024 to now. So Democrats have done 11 percentage points better in a special election than they did in November 2024. In 2018, the average for all elections held in the 2018 cycle before the midterms, all special elections, is 10. So we are above where the long-term average was in 2018 for change in support for Democrats since the last election. And on protests, right, there's like plenty of protests in 2018, 2019 on Trump, mostly small scale. The protests that we saw this weekend, the so-called hands-off protests against Trump and Musk, have churned up more search interest in protesting Trump than any protest since the Women's March in 2017, which was absolutely massive. I think between like 5 and 10 million people across the country showed up for that. So look, I mean, like the election's not held yet, whatever, but all of this stuff is happening at a point when Trump is already weakened, when there's going to be budget fights in Congress in the next couple months. And they're already, and the administration's already on the back foot defending some of its, or a lot of its actions on government funding and hiring in the courts and on immigration and stuff in the courts. So like if they were looking for a good economic win to help the administration along, they got the opposite. It just seems like there's a lot happening for Democratic momentum now.
And I do at some point in a later podcast, I'm just going to bookmark this, want to talk about like what it all means, particularly to Trump. Like Trump's never going to run for election again. I mean, unless he wants to be, right, like I've said before, the governor of Florida, the mayor of Palm Beach, whatever. So what does it mean to him? And what does it mean to Republicans who are the ones who are going to pay the price electorally, but also seem allergic to countering Trump for the most part on a lot of this stuff? So how does that whole dynamic play out? We'll save that for another day because we're going to leave it there for today. Thank you, Elliott and Mary.
Thanks, Galen.
Thanks for having us. It was fun.
My name is Galen Druk. I'm in the early days of getting this podcast off the ground, and I appreciate your support in any way possible. Subscribe to GD Politics wherever you get your podcasts, and if you'd be so kind, also rate and review us. Maybe even tell a friend about the podcast. I've been hearing from people who actually don't know that 538 was shut down and have been confused and want an explanation for why we aren't publishing new podcasts. So maybe tell some of your friends who you think are listeners who might not know that we've migrated somewhere else. Anyway, also importantly, subscribe at the Substack, gdpolitics.com, where you'll get updates on what we're doing, extras, and you can support the project directly. Thanks for listening, and we will see you soon.